Let's now look at account maintenance with LDAP. We will create a group as well as a user and add the user to the group and make various changes to the LDAP DIT as we would using normal user mod, user add, and standard Linux tools. So let's label this section account maintenance, basic account maintenance, some trivial tasks. So our task is to create a user, and we'll name that user project user 1. That's the first task, and ultimately create a group that we bind the user to for the sake of applying permissions to the file system. Once we've done that, then we can try adding various users, pre-existing users, to the defined group, as well as changing password information for existing users. And we'll also look at changing group names and usernames using LDAP modify RDN to modify the relative distinguished name. So we've got a few simple tasks ahead of us, but nonetheless they can help you to get really acquainted with these simple account maintenance routines. So how do we create an LDAP user? Well, the easiest way is to extract LDIF information from an existing account. So note, use LDIF info from existing account. That's the easiest way to do it, unless you know the attributes by heart or have memorized them and can recall them on point, but most of us can't, so we generally rely upon what's already defined. Let's log into the remote system, although we could have executed LDAP search from here. And we'll execute an LDAP search against the people OU. We'll bind. Let's just note that we'll use LDAP search using LDAP search. So we'll bind as cn equals manager, case insensitive, dc equals Linux CBT, dc equals internal, with simple authentication, verbosity turned on, and we want to search in particular the OU people as opposed to the base of the DIT. Now, since our DIT is accessible anonymously, we can just connect without authenticating. So let's history grep LDAP search and extract an anonymous search. Here's one, 771. So 771 searches the organizational unit people and returns all of the existing items. Now from here we can extract information that's useful, such as, let's take LCBT Sun Local 1, the properties thereof that is, and indicate the items that are to be created. Now additionally, we could use the dump from the paddle scripts, if you recall. Let's take a quick look here at our migration tools directory. If we cat the contents of users.susa2, we see LDIF information. LDAP search provides us with live information, whereas this is not live information, but it works just the same. So either or will work in any event. Let's rerun that LDAP search, and we'll extract LCBT Sun Local 1 and paste it into an empty buffer in gedit, and then tailor it to suit our needs. So our objective is to create a new user named project user 1 for the sake of applying permissions. Let's remove the commented field and define the UID as project user 1. We'll just call the user proj user 1. Same OU, and the UID will be the same. The CN will be the same, the common name of the user. And here are the various object classes associated with the user: account, POSIX account, top, shadow account, login shell. Let's set a home directory of home proj user 1. And this is the default or principal GID that the user belongs to. Now, depending on the flavor of Unix or Linux that you use will determine the default GID. If using SUSE Linux, for example, all users belong to the default users group. To make the determination, we can LDAP search the determination of the GID that belongs to people we can search in a variety of ways. We could use groups, for example, or we could use LDAP search, groups as a user who we're logged in as, who's a member of the users group, or we can use LDAP search, the root isn't, which is why it didn't show up, to search the group OU, returning all objects contained within, and then we could grep for the user, for the group named users, or search a specific field such as CN. So let's change this search from object class to CN equals, and this returns a lone group. So we can associate the user we're about to create with the GID 100. This will make the user default to the GID 100 as opposed to 1. And this is a proper LDIF to define this new user. So let's go ahead and create that user. So back to our notes. Let's just indicate what we're doing here. Create a user named produser1. Let's update the name. Derived from LDIF output. Wherever you get your LDIF output, whether it be from the paddle scripts or from a live LDAP search. And obviously to add this user to the DIT, we use LDAP add. So use LDAP add to add user to DIT. But adding the user doesn't create the membership to the group. That we can do after, or we can do during the create process. Adding this user creates a membership to a default group, but not to a subsequent group. That's history grep LDAP add and find a recent entry or instance in our history table which does not reference a file such as 720. This will prompt and ask us for the password to connect to LDAP as manager. Then it waits on standard in for us to paste the various items for the user. Notice adding new entry, UID prod user 1 to the DIT, and if we echo the exit status, it's clean. So now when we research using LDAP search the people OU, we will see momentarily that the new user exists. Now a few questions come to mind. In particular, what is the default password of the user? There is no default password set for this user, which means we should set a password. We'll do that momentarily. Now let's add a group and then add the user to the group and then work on the password. So we've said so far that we want to create a username produser1 which will belong to a group which then has permissions to some file system, one or more file system spaces. So next task, create a group named Project X, for example. Again, derived from LDIF output. Most of the imports or objects that are created in your LDAP DIT derive from one or more LDIF sources, such as LDAP search or using one of the paddle scripts. So how do we create a group? Well, we do so by looking at the groups that currently exist. Let's LDAP search a recent search for various groups, and here we see various groups. We simply take one from the list and be sure to increment the ID for the GID number field. Otherwise, LDAP add will complain that the GID exists, the GID number exists. So here's our derived LDIF, which we'll create in a new buffer. And we want this group to be called Project X. And we want the GID number to be, let's say, 1000, which will set it apart from any of the other groups that are defined. So this will allow us to add the group providing we run LDAP add, but we're not yet set up to tie the user to the group. That will do by modifying, using the LDAP modify utility to modify the default attribute list or schema of the group. So just like before, use LDAP add to add group to DIT. Let's return to the shell and find LDAP add in our history. It prompts. We will indicate the simple password and Control-Shift-V to paste the contents of this new group. And there's an error. The CN or common name is redundant, so when we Control-D, notice naming violation, and that's expected behavior. So since that is expected behavior, let's update CN users to be what it should be, and that is Project X. Good thing about the directory is that it will confirm OpenLDAP, that is, all of the attributes to be sure that duplicates are not specified, at least for fields where duplicates cannot exist, like with the common name field. Let's turn on verbosity and authenticate once more, Control-Shift-V, then Control-D at the end of the input where we see that the group has been added. So now when we redump the list of groups using LDAP search, we see the new group. It's been added with a GID of 1000. So now we're in a position to add the user project or proj user 1 to the group Project X. Now there are ways that you can confirm the current group membership of proj user 1. The simplest way is to just simply type groups proj user 1, and it returns a list of groups, usually with the primary group being echoed first. So we see that the user proj user 1 does not belong to the Project X group, which means we can go ahead and assign permissions for the group, but the user proj user 1, when logged into the system, will not be able to take advantage of those permissions. So before we make the assignment, let's just show you what we mean. Our third task will be to create a directory where members of the Project X group will be able to manipulate. So create a directory /Project X for members of the LDAP group Project X. And we'll just do so off the root of the file system for simplicity, using make directory Project X. So the directory now exists, but it's an LSLD, which will list the permissions momentarily, reveals that it's owned by a root and root. So now we need to update the permissions. So a simple make directory Project X, followed by a chown, or change group in this case, to Project X from root, that is, on the directory Project X. We could also use chown, but we'd have to indicate the user : group name. Now, to be sure that the Project X group appears or is accessible to the name service switch engine, we can use getEnt to list the list of, or to return the list of groups where we see Project X. So now if we execute change group, that is Project X, against /Project X, and then rerun LSLD, which is what we're doing, you see that the directory is now owned by Project X, but the group cannot write to the directory. So let's update the permissions to be changed-mod, or using changed-mod 775 Project X. And now the group members will be able to manipulate the contents of the directory. So the final step is to simply changed-mod 775 Project X. So now we have a directory that members of the Project X group can write to. Now we've created a user who currently does not belong to the group, so let's confirm that the user cannot write to the directory. So for confirm user proj user 1 is unable to write to /Project X. Very simple test. In order to do that, we'll SSH in, but the user doesn't have a password. So that leads us to the password stage. Let's jump a step. 5. Use LDAP password to assign a password to the user proj user 1. Now we can do this as the root DN or as the user himself, providing we can log in as that user. If you log in as a user and supply credentials to bind to the LDAP DIT, you'll be able to at least change your own password. But if you bind to the DIT as the root DN, then you can change any user's password. So with that said, how do we change passwords? Well, there's a command, LDAP password. Very simple to use. Let's just list its usage. We're going to execute LDAP password and bind to the DN as the bind DN, which is for us the following. Followed by some options such as simple authentication that we've used, verbosity, prompt for password, followed by the DN of the user we'd like to update. So this is where we indicate the distinguished name of the user. Now we know the user to be proj user 1 in the people OU, but we can confirm it using LDAP search. And this will list the various groups, so let's focus in on the people OU. And it will be the last entry in the list, and there it is. So here's the full DN. We need to include the DN in the LDAP password command towards the end in order for it to update the password. Now, here's something interesting, or one of those gotchas or caveats you should know about LDAP password. If you don't indicate the S option, the lowercase or uppercase S options, then LDAP password will auto-generate a password for you. We'll show you what we mean. That's the default behavior. So here we're asking LDAP password to change the UID proj user 1's password. We must enter or authenticate to the LDAP DIT, to the directory information tree, and notice a password was returned. Result is success. It returns us a password. So note, default behavior of LDAP password is to auto-generate a password. Now if that works for you, go ahead by all means use it if it's complex enough or meets your complexity requirements. The default SUSE LDAP configuration conforms to password policies, or the password policy defined on the SUSE system. You can use YAS to impact your password policy in terms of complexity, length of the password, and expiration, and whether or not a recently used password can be reused, and so on. But for now, for the user proj user 1, this will be the password to authenticate. We'll just keep this here for a moment because we will change the password. At least we have a password that we can use to SSH into the system. Now we haven't created a home directory for the user, so let's go ahead and make directory home proj user 1. And if that works, we'll chown proj user 1 dot users / home proj user 1. And if that all goes well, we'll echo the exit status. It's 0, so we're safe to assume that an LSLD of home proj user 1 will return the permissions that we expect, and it has. So with that said, we may now log in using SSH. So let's SSH in as proj user 1 at localhost, and we'll need to authenticate as the password that we have in memory using Control-Shift-V, or by copying it and pasting it. Let's try that. And it lets us in. It knows us to be proj user 1. So pasting it works. We're in the directory. Now, with respect to writing to the root / project X, well, LSLD / project X reveals the permissions. If we try to use, for example, the sequence command, which comes with Linux distros and can be used to return a sequence of numbers to standard out or be redirected to a file. So let's use sequence to write 1000 entries to a file in Project X, and we'll call it our username produser1 dot text. Notice permission denied. And this is because, as far as NSS is concerned, the name service switch module or component which handles authentication, the user produser1 is not a member of Project X and is certainly not the user root. So we are unable to write to that directory. But if we ran the sequence command in our home directory where we do have write permissions, it will obviously work. So produser1.text. And of course the echo of the exit status is clean, and we see the file exists. It's 3,893 bytes. So now on to the grouping. How do we update the LDAP DIT so that this newly created user, produser1, becomes a member of Project X? Let's create that as our 6th task. Or it is, we confirm the user is unable to write, so we've already done this. So we'll make it our 6th task. And that'll be to add user produser1 to group Project X. Now we need to use LDAP modify to make this change because the group already exists, but the group currently has no members. Again, if we rerun LDAP search, let's log out from this account and rerun LDAP search on the group OU, and there we see Project X. It has no members. There is an attribute which isn't apparent here, which comes from the POSIX group schema called member UID. It stores a list of members of the group. So we need to use LDAP modify to modify this distinguished name for this group to add the attribute member ID. So that command will resemble the following: cn equals manager, DC Linux CBT, DC internal. Our typical options: simple authentication, verbosity, prompt for password, and LDAP modify will prompt on standard in for the LDIF entries. So let's paste this to the screen and then compose our LDIF entries. So now it'll wait for us after we authenticate at least on standard in, and we will indicate the LDIF entries. Now, change entries are straightforward. Let's remove this group item. We can take the LDIF from the dump. Here's the LDIF, and modify it to suit our needs. Let's just copy this block. We don't need the full thing actually, just DN and some other important information. The DN is important. We need to clearly specify to LDAP modify what we want to do. We don't need any of the object classes. We don't need the CN because that's indicated in the DN, and we don't need the GID number. All we need is DN followed by the change type, which we're going to set to modify because we're modifying an existing object, followed by an addition of the member UID attribute. Now again, there's no need to memorize schema information. The schemas are located in the schema directory where they're included, so you can peruse those schemas to find attributes that may not be obvious. And then we'd like to define member UID to be this particular user, produser1. If we have a list of users, we can separate them using comma. So this LDIF will add the attribute member UID to the group. Let's paste it in, and the modification is complete. And then we'll use LDAP search again to enumerate it. Now notice that Project X has one member belonging to it. Let's just save this document, and we'll call it modify group object member UID dot LDIF. Again, so much of what you do in LDAP involves tailoring LDIFs. This is the bulk of it. And we'll close this particular LDIF. This is implied by most of the other work that we've done. So back to our notes. Add user to proj user 1, or add user proj user 1 to group project X. We've included the LDIF, and of course we should confirm. So use LDAP search or getEnt to confirm. And now that the user is a member of the group, the permissions should of course work. Well, let's re-SSH in to be sure of that. And of course we could confirm using groups. Groups proj user 1 will return the list of groups that the user is a member of, users and project X. Then let's re-SSH in to the local host. And this assumes that we know the password, this password here. We've yet to change the password of the user. We'll do that in a second. And now we're in. Now let's navigate, or let's call up that sequence command, which is in our history. And now you see it works, and an LSL of project X reveals the file. We can even copy the version that's in our directory, our home directory, home proj user 1. So let's copy the file in our directory to project X, and it works, no problems. Exit status shows up properly. That's because we've updated the LDAP group membership information. So to recap, creating a user is straightforward. Derive your LDIF from pre-existing users. If you have no pre-existing users, use the paddle series of scripts to generate LDIFs based on your etc password file. And to create a group, either derive from an existing group or, again, use the paddle scripts to generate the LDIF necessary. Now, to add a user to a group, you need to ensure that the group has the member UID. If you're using the POSIX group object class, as we are, you need to ensure that the member UID attribute is available and it has one or more users associated with it, at which point you use LDAP modify to modify the group. No differently than using user mod to modify a user to allow it to belong to a particular group. Now, how about changing the password of the user? Well, there are multiple ways to do so. Let's just scroll down towards the bottom. We can do so as the user manager, which happens to be root within the LDAP DIT context, or as the user himself. So our 7th task is to change user or users' passwords. We can begin with project X. So for project X, we'll execute LDAP password. We'll bind to the directory as the bind DN, which is CN equals manager, and DC equals internal. All of our familiar options such as verbosity, simple authentication, prompt for password. Now again, if you don't indicate a password using upper or lower S, LDAP will generate a password for you. LDAP password, that is. The utility will generate a password for you. It will create the password in the DIT and echo it to standard out. So if you have a password that you'd like to use, indicate it. Now, if you want to specify, which we don't suggest, the password on the command line, use the lowercase s option, followed by the password, such as ABC123. And in between quotes, indicate the DN that you'd like to impact. The DN in this case happens to be UID equals proj user 1, and we can confirm that by looking for in our dump here, a recent LDIF dump, the UID of the user proj user 1. Let's just scroll up and find it. If not, we'll drop out of our SU shell and re-execute it. And we should see it towards the bottom of the list. And that's project X, so it doesn't appear within this window. Let's drop the shell, rerun LDAP search, and this dumps the user project X. So we need the DN of the user. That's project X. We want the user instead of the group. So let's find a search of users in our history. And here's a search, and there we see proj user 1. Notice the password isn't returned to standard out. So here's the DN of the user. UID, proj user 1, people OU, followed by the remainder of the tree. This needs to be indicated on the command line or specified in a file, either or. This will change the user's password to ABC123. It prompts us for the LDAP password because we indicated the user's password on the command line. Now the user's password is ABC123, and if we attempt to SSH in again as that user, we will have to type in ABC123 in order to be authenticated. And we can also log in to any remote system, such as the Red Hat box, for example. Let's SSH in as this user, Linux CBT, at the host Linux CBT serve4. And you'll see, once we've authenticated using ABC123, and Pam has set up the directories for us, that we're logged into the remote host using LDAP for the first time, by the way. So that takes care of changing the user's password. Now again, we can change the password without indicating it on the command line. So let's drop the lower S option and remove the password altogether and change it to upper S. This prompts us on the command line. Now notice that it reads new password. This is not for the bind DN user. This is for the user with which you, or with whom you'd like to effect the change. So let's indicate the password again as ABC123. And now we have to indicate the LDAP password to make the change take effect. And now the password has been successfully updated. If we SSH in again as the user and indicate the proper password, we'll be logged in. So that's another way to change the password. So B would be to indicate everything we've indicated in A, but changing lower S to upper S and omitting on the command line the password. That does the trick. And you may also change the password as the user himself by logging in as the user and indicating the same series. So let's copy this series of commands, and in our SSH window, let's SSH in as ProdUser1 to the remote system. Now just a quick note, if we execute this command, it will attempt to change the password on the local instance, meaning the remote system, the local instance of LDAP. Let's indicate our new password. And it'll prompt us for the root DN's password. Now, this has referenced the change to the host server. But there are times, if there isn't a referral set up in the LDAP configuration, where LDAP password and similar tools will return a referral. It'll tell you you need to go to the primary server or to a different server in order to make the change. But in this case, we're able to change the password without any problems, which means LDAP password followed the referral and took care of it for us. Now another user management task is to be able to change the relative DN or RDN of an object. So change RDN or relative DN, relative distinguished name, or RDN of an object. And usually we do this for users. There's a separate command, LDAP mod RDN. Its syntax is as follows: LDAP mod RDN, the bind DN, which we know as CN equals manager, and equals internal, followed by typical options, and a new option, -R, which removes the old RDN information, followed by W for password, and DN followed by RDN. Now what this means is as follows: if we want to change the RDN for a given DN, which is a full distinguished name, such as, let's say, ProdUser1, we first specify the full DN, then the new RDN. So here is the full DN for ProdUser1. This is indicated first, followed by the new RDN. Let's call this user proj user2. This will change the user's name just like usermod will do for you, from one username to another username. Let's try this from the shell. This is a useful utility. We'll have to authenticate as typical. And there's an error in our syntax. Let's just double check the RDN. That should be UID equals proj user2. Let's retry it. And this should work. We need to indicate the actual prefix, which is UID. Sometimes it's CN. And we should also note this will not update the CN attribute. Let's authenticate. And this time it's succeeded, which means the exit status should be 0. Let's execute an LDAP search. And now we see that proj user1 has been renamed in its distinguished name attribute to proj user2. However, the CN record is still proj user1. To update the CN record, change the LDAP modify command we specified earlier, or use LDAP modify with a change type of modify to get this to change. Now we can also change group names using this syntax, so perhaps as another task we'll paste a similar command indicating the name of the group. Instead of UID we can of course dump it from the shell. Let's focus in on the OU equals group to get the distinguished name. And there we see Project X. So the distinguished name has a prefix of CN equals Project X in the group organizational unit. So let's copy this into memory. And instead of UID equals proj user1, we'll change the group, or this to be the group of Project X. And its new CN will be, let's name it Project Y. And then we'll change it momentarily once we confirm that the change has executed successfully. Now this will not change any memberships to the group, of course. And this deleted the old RDN, so let's redump with LDAP search. And there we see Project X is now named Project Y. Its DN record has been updated, and its CN record. Both have been updated. Unlike the user record, the group record uses the CN as its attribute to denote the unique identifier of the group. Now let's reset it to Project X. Now by the way, if you're concerned about the permissions on the directory that we created, let's lsld /project X, and you see the permissions or the ownership has been updated to reflect the UID Project Y, because the OS, Unix, Linux, etc. ties UIDs and GIDs, or the numerical equivalents of UIDs and GIDs, or usernames and group names, to a resource such as a file or a directory as opposed to the name. So Project Y is reflected as we expected. Now let's LDAP modify RDN, changing this time CN equals Project Y to CN equals Project X. We'll authenticate and then rerun LDAP search, and we see it's now Project X. And if we re-lsld Project X, we see it's been returned. It's currently Project Y. This will be updated momentarily. This is cached, but it will resolve to the current value shortly enough. So that's a little bit about managing your users. You can use YAST, of course, which is built into SUSE, or the Red Hat tools or Solaris tools, but it's generally best if you use the raw LDAP tools to make the modifications. Now we haven't looked at LDAP browser in a while. Let's take a look at YAST just to see what the directory looks like at this stage. And we'll authenticate. And this is YAST locally. We need to launch YAST on the remote system. let's log back in, ensuring that we turn on upper X to re-export the graphical environment, and then launch YAST 2. That's the local instance. Let's try it again. This will bring up YAST momentarily, and then we'll navigate to Network Services. LDAP Browser will of course be prompted for the root DN to connect to the base DN. And there's the tree. It includes LDAP config, hosts, all with common names, services, and this is going to be a long list. We've yet to look at it from this vantage point. Protocols, people, and let's collapse, and we see the various users we've defined, including the recently defined project user 2 and various groups, including those imported from the SUSE box plus our project X group. And of course we can modify data using the LDAP browser interface by assigning fields that are supported. For example, in member UID, using a comma we can denote that other users belong to this particular group, and it'll update it for us, saving the changes to the LDAP directory. Now when we confirm from the shell using groups, project X for example, and this is no such user, so let's indicate proj user 1, and let's double check our user. We'll get into password, and it's proj user 2 at this stage, which will be updated momentarily. And we see it's currently a part of users, but momentarily it'll be updated. The LDAP information has to be copied over. So by the next section we'll see those changes. So we've looked at a few tools: LDAP password, LDAP modify RDN in the event that we want to change the unique name of an object, as well as LDAP password to change one's password. These are some of the tools we use to administer users and groups within an open LDAP environment. Obviously it's not as streamlined and as easy to use as a graphical interface, but nonetheless the benefits outweigh any investment in time, in that you'll be able to centralize users, groups, and distribute those permissions across all of your connected Linux and Unix systems.